Right now, modern criminal justice systems, whatever their genuine flaws and ongoing debates, operate under legal frameworks that generally prohibit cruel and unusual punishment as a basic foundational principle. This wasn't always the case throughout human history. Many past societies developed punishment systems specifically designed around public suffering, deterrence through fear, and the deliberate demonstration of state or authority power, rather than anything resembling modern concepts of proportionate justice or rehabilitation. So, what did some of history's most severe punishment systems actually look like? And what do they reveal about how different societies throughout history have historically approached crime, authority, and social control? Let's dig into this properly, focused specifically on the historical and social context surrounding these practices, since understanding why societies developed and maintained these approaches offers considerably more genuine historical insight than simply cataloging disturbing specific details for their own sake. Let's start with the broader historical context worth understanding first, because it helps explain why so many different, otherwise unconnected historical societies independently developed such severe punishment systems. For most of human history, states and governing authorities generally lacked the kind of extensive law enforcement infrastructure, reliable investigative techniques, and consistent professional judicial systems that modern societies typically rely on. Given this practical limitation, many historical societies turned toward punishment systems specifically designed around maximizing visible deterrence, publicly demonstrating the severe consequences of breaking a given society's laws in the hopes of discouraging others from similar behavior, rather than focusing primarily on precisely calibrated, individually proportionate justice in the way modern legal systems generally aim to achieve, at least in principle. This detail helps frame the broader historical pattern worth understanding throughout this discussion. Severe historical punishment wasn't generally about addressing an individual case in isolation. It functioned as a deliberate public demonstration of governing authority and power intended to discourage an entire watching population from similar future behavior, which is part of why so many historical punishment systems specifically emphasized public visibility and spectacle as a core, deliberate feature rather than existing as some kind of purely private, individually contained legal consequence. Let's talk about public execution more broadly, because this represents one of the most historically widespread, well-documented forms of severe punishment worth exploring specifically. Public execution in various different specific forms appeared across an enormous range of different historical societies and time periods, generally conducted in public spaces specifically to maximize the deterrent effect already discussed, allowing large numbers of people to directly witness the consequences of serious criminal offenses or, in many historical cases, offenses that would not be considered remotely comparable to serious crime by any modern legal standard, including various forms of religious or political dissent. This detail is worth including because it reveals something important worth understanding about historical punishment systems more broadly. The specific category of behavior actually subject to severe punishment varied dramatically across different historical societies, frequently extending well beyond what contemporary societies would recognize as truly serious criminal offenses. Let's talk about torture as an investigative and punitive tool too, because this represents another significant, well-documented category worth exploring within appropriate historical context. Various historical legal systems incorporated torture, both as an investigative tool intended to extract confessions or information, and as a punitive measure in its own right, reflecting a historical legal philosophy considerably different from modern evidentiary standards and legal protections. Historians studying this broader historical pattern generally emphasize that torture as an investigative tool proved notoriously unreliable, frequently producing false confessions from individuals simply attempting to end their immediate suffering, a documented historical pattern that eventually contributed directly to the gradual development of modern legal principles, specifically prohibiting this practice and instead requiring more reliable forms of evidence within contemporary judicial systems. Let's talk about the specific social and political function severe punishment served within many historical monarchies and other authoritarian governing systems too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. In societies governed by monarchs or other forms of concentrated individual authority, severe punishment frequently served an additional, specific political function beyond simple deterrence, directly reinforcing and publicly demonstrating the ruling authority's absolute power over the lives and bodies of their subjects. This political dimension helps explain why punishment severity in many historical societies correlated closely with offenses specifically threatening or challenging the ruling authority itself. Treason, rebellion, and various forms of direct challenge to established political power frequently received the most severe, most publicly demonstrative punishments available within that particular society's broader punishment system, considerably exceeding the severity typically applied to offenses causing comparable or even greater direct harm to ordinary individuals within that same society. Let's talk about how punishment severity often correlated with social class and status too, because this represents an important, historically consistent pattern worth exploring directly. Across numerous historical societies, the specific severity of punishment a person faced for a given offense frequently depended significantly on their social class and status, with wealthier, higher status individuals frequently facing considerably less severe consequences compared to lower status individuals facing punishment for identical or comparable offenses. This pattern reveals something important worth understanding about historical punishment systems more broadly. They frequently functioned not simply as neutral mechanisms for addressing criminal behavior, but as tools that could reinforce and maintain existing social hierarchies and power structures, applying dramatically different practical consequences depending on a person's existing social position within that particular society. Let's talk about religious and ideological justification for severe punishment too, because this represents an important, historically significant dimension worth exploring specifically. Many historical punishment systems drew directly on religious or broader ideological justification, framing severe punishment as not merely a practical deterrent, but as a form of moral or spiritual necessity, sometimes explicitly tied to specific religious concepts regarding sin, purification, or divine justice. This religious and ideological framing often made these punishment systems considerably more difficult to challenge or reform from within that same society, since questioning the punishment system risked being framed as directly questioning the broader religious or ideological framework the punishment system was explicitly built upon and justified through. Let's talk about some of the earliest documented legal codes that formalized severe punishment too, because grounding this discussion in specific historical examples helps illustrate how far back this broader pattern actually extends. Ancient Mesopotamian legal codes, among the earliest formal written legal systems in human history, explicitly prescribed specific, often severe punishments for a wide range of offenses, frequently organized according to a principle of proportionate retribution that specified corresponding physical consequences for specific categories of harm caused to another person. These ancient legal codes are historically significant precisely because they represent some of the earliest attempts to formally codify punishment into a written, publicly known legal system, rather than leaving punishment decisions purely to informal custom or the unrestricted personal discretion of a ruling authority. Even though the specific punishments these ancient codes prescribed would be considered extraordinarily severe by modern legal standards. Historians studying these early legal systems note that formal codification itself represented a meaningful step toward more consistent, predictable legal process compared to entirely arbitrary, undocumented punishment decisions. Let's talk about the specific sociological function public punishment spectacles served within many historical communities too, because understanding this broader social dynamic helps explain why these events frequently attracted such large public audiences rather than being treated as something communities generally sought to avoid witnessing. Historians and sociologists studying this pattern generally note that public punishment events served multiple overlapping social functions within many historical communities, functioning simultaneously as a demonstration of governing authority, a shared communal experience reinforcing a community's collective moral and legal boundaries, and, in some documented historical contexts, a significant social occasion in its own right, sometimes accompanied by considerable public gathering and commercial activity surrounding the event itself. This detail is worth including because it illustrates how thoroughly severe punishment became integrated into the broader fabric of ordinary community and civic life in many historical societies. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Rather than existing as some kind of separate, exceptional occurrence clearly set apart from everyday social experience. Let's talk about how punishment practices varied considerably across different regions and historical periods too, because it's worth resisting any assumption that severe historical punishment represented some kind of single, uniform global practice applied identically everywhere throughout history. Different historical societies developed meaningfully different specific approaches to punishment severity, the specific categories of offense subject to the most severe consequences, and the broader legal and religious justifications underlying their particular punishment systems, shaped by each society's own specific historical circumstances, religious traditions, and political structures. Some historical societies maintained comparatively more restrained, proportionate punishment systems even by relatively early historical standards, while others developed considerably more severe systems, illustrating that punishment severity throughout history reflected specific, variable social and political choices rather than representing some kind of fixed, inevitable stage every historical society necessarily passed through in some uniform, predictable developmental sequence. Let's talk about the specific role legal professionals and religious authorities played in administering and justifying these punishment systems too, because this represents an important, often overlooked institutional dimension worth exploring specifically. In many historical societies, the actual administration of severe punishment involved a complex institutional apparatus, including judges, religious officials, and various other formally recognized authorities whose specific role involved determining guilt, prescribing appropriate punishment according to that society's specific legal and religious framework, and overseeing the actual administration of punishment itself. This institutional complexity is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that severe historical punishment wasn't simply a matter of arbitrary individual cruelty, but rather operated through formal, socially recognized institutional structures involving considerable procedural complexity and specifically designated institutional authority, even while the underlying substantive punishments themselves remained, by modern standards, extraordinarily severe. Let's talk about documented historical resistance and criticism of severe punishment systems that existed even before the broader Enlightenment-era reform movements already discussed too, because this represents an important, frequently overlooked detail worth including for a more complete historical picture. Even within societies broadly maintaining severe punishment systems, historical records occasionally document specific individuals, religious figures, and philosophical thinkers who raised direct criticism or moral objection to particular punishment practices, suggesting that ethical discomfort with excessive punishment severity wasn't purely a modern Enlightenment-era development, but rather represented a recurring, if historically marginalized and generally unsuccessful, thread of internal moral criticism that appeared periodically throughout various historical societies, even when that specific criticism failed to produce meaningful, lasting institutional or legal reform during that particular historical period. Let's talk about how the actual historical record of these punishment practices gets studied and verified by modern researchers too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Historians studying this topic rely on a combination of surviving legal codes and court records, contemporary written accounts and chronicles describing specific punishment practices, and archaeological evidence in certain cases, allowing researchers to build a reasonably confident, evidence-based picture of how these systems actually operated in practice, rather than relying purely on later, sometimes exaggerated or embellished popular accounts and legend that developed considerably after the actual historical period in question. This careful, evidence-based historical methodology matters considerably, since popular culture and casual historical discussion sometimes exaggerates or distorts the specific historical record regarding certain punishment practices, making careful, source-based historical scholarship particularly important for accurately understanding this truly difficult historical subject matter. Let's talk about how and why these severe historical punishment systems eventually began changing and declining too, because this represents an important, seriously hopeful chapter worth exploring before continuing this discussion. Beginning particularly during the Enlightenment period in various parts of the world, philosophers, legal reformers, and social critics began developing increasingly influential arguments specifically challenging the effectiveness, morality, and broader social value of severe, spectacle-based historical punishment systems. These reform movements generally argued that punishment should focus on proportionality, genuine deterrence through reliable and consistent law enforcement rather than occasional, extreme spectacle, and increasingly, on rehabilitation rather than pure retribution or public demonstration of state power. This gradual intellectual and legal shift eventually contributed to the significant decline of many of the most severe historical punishment practices across numerous societies, though this reform process unfolded very differently and at very different speeds across different specific countries and legal systems throughout the world. Let's talk about how historians and legal scholars actually study this difficult topic responsibly too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Responsible historical scholarship on severe historical punishment generally focuses on understanding the broader social, political, and legal context that produced and sustained these systems, rather than simply cataloging disturbing specific details in isolation. This approach helps illuminate remarkably important historical patterns, including how governing authority, social hierarchy, and religious or ideological justification worked together to sustain these systems over extended historical periods, and how gradual legal and philosophical reform eventually challenged and transformed these systems, offering valuable historical insight into how societies actually changed their fundamental legal and ethical frameworks over time. Let's talk about how this history connects to ongoing contemporary debates regarding criminal justice too, because this represents an important, directly relevant point worth including before wrapping up this discussion. Contemporary discussions regarding criminal justice reform, proportionate sentencing, and prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment draw directly, whether explicitly or implicitly, on this same broader historical understanding already explored throughout this topic, recognizing that punishment systems reflect a society's broader values and power structures, and that meaningful legal reform generally requires directly challenging not just specific individual punishment practices, but the broader social and political assumptions that originally justified and sustained those practices in the first place. Let's talk about how severe punishment systems interacted with historical patterns of colonialism and conquest too, because this represents an important, historically significant dimension worth exploring. Specifically, various colonial powers throughout history frequently imposed their own specific punishment systems onto conquered or colonized populations, sometimes combining elements of their own legal traditions with locally existing punishment practices, and often applying particularly severe punishment specifically toward colonized populations resisting or challenging colonial authority. This pattern reinforces the broader point already established throughout this discussion regarding how severe punishment historically functioned as a direct tool for maintaining and reinforcing political power and authority, extending this particular dynamic into the specific historical context of colonial conquest and control, where the power imbalance between the punishing authority and the punished population was frequently even more extreme and more directly enforced through military and political domination. Let's talk about the specific development of modern international human rights frameworks and how they directly emerged in response to this broader historical pattern too, because this represents an important, forward-looking dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this discussion. Following particularly significant historical atrocities during the 20th century, the international community developed increasingly formal legal frameworks specifically prohibiting torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment as a matter of recognized international law, representing a direct, deliberate response to the long historical pattern of severe punishment already explored extensively throughout this topic. These modern international frameworks explicitly draw on the accumulated historical understanding of how severe punishment systems tend to develop and sustain themselves, specifically designing legal and institutional safeguards intended to prevent the kind of systematic, normalized, severe punishment that characterized so much of earlier human history already discussed throughout this discussion. Let's talk about ongoing scholarly debate regarding measuring genuine historical progress in this specific area too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly, before concluding this discussion, that historians and legal scholars don't entirely agree on how complete or how secure this broader historical shift away from severe punishment practices actually is. Some scholars emphasize the genuine, substantial legal and institutional progress already discussed throughout this topic, while others point to specific ongoing practices in various parts of the contemporary world that continue reflecting many of the same underlying patterns already explored throughout this discussion, suggesting the broader historical trajectory away from severe, spectacle-based punishment remains an ongoing, incomplete process, rather than a fully finished, permanently secured historical achievement. This scholarly debate is worth acknowledging honestly, since presenting this topic as though severe punishment represented purely a settled matter of distant historical interest would understate the ongoing active nature of this particular area of legal and ethical development still unfolding today. Let's talk about how education and historical memory specifically function regarding this difficult topic too, because this represents an important, closely related consideration worth including before this discussion concludes. Many contemporary museums, historical sites, and educational institutions have developed specific approaches to presenting this difficult history to the public, generally emphasizing historical context and broader social understanding rather than sensationalized or gratuitous specific detail, reflecting the same responsible scholarly approach already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This careful, contextual approach to historical education serves an important, ongoing social function, helping successive generations understand this difficult history specifically as a foundation for recognizing and preventing similar patterns from recurring, rather than treating this history purely as distant, disconnected curiosity with no meaningful ongoing relevance to how societies continue organizing power, authority, and justice today. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full historical picture of history's most severe punishment systems turns out to reveal something considerably more significant than simple historical curiosity about disturbing practices from the past. These systems generally emerged from a specific combination of limited state investigative and enforcement capability, deliberate public deterrence strategy, the reinforcement of existing social and political power structures, and religious or ideological justification that made these systems particularly resistant to internal challenge or reform. Understanding this broader context helps explain not just how these severe historical punishment systems operated, but why they eventually declined through sustained philosophical, legal, and social reform efforts that gradually shifted governing societies toward the more proportionate, rights-protective legal frameworks many contemporary societies now maintain, at least as a stated legal principle and ongoing aspiration. So the next time history's most severe punishment practices come up in conversation, whether through documentaries, historical media, or casual discussion, it's worth engaging with this difficult history specifically as an opportunity to understand how societies actually organize power, enforce social control, and eventually, through sustained effort and reform, transform their own fundamental legal and ethical frameworks over time, rather than simply as a source of shocking historical trivia disconnected from any deeper social or political understanding. Let's talk briefly about how museums and historical institutions specifically balance honest historical representation against the risk of sensationalizing this difficult subject matter too, because this represents a final, practically relevant detail worth including. Many institutions specifically presenting this history to the public have developed careful curatorial guidelines emphasizing broader historical and social context over graphic specific detail, reflecting the same responsible scholarly approach already discussed extensively throughout this topic, and offering a useful, practical model worth appreciating for how any difficult historical subject matter can be presented honestly and educationally, without either minimizing its genuine severity or presenting it in a way that reduces serious historical suffering to mere shock value or entertainment. Understanding how severe punishment systems actually functioned throughout history, the specific social, political, and religious structures that sustained them, and the sustained reform efforts that eventually challenged and transformed them, offers genuine practical value for recognizing similar warning signs in any contemporary system of power and authority, reinforcing that this kind of careful historical study serves purposes extending well beyond simple curiosity about the distant past alone. This same broader principle applies equally to any society examining its own current practices honestly, recognizing that the specific institutions a society builds around punishment and authority say something meaningful about that society's deeper values, whether or not that society itself fully recognizes this connection at the time. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If severe historical punishment systems consistently reflected the specific social, political, and religious structures of the societies that maintained them, what does that suggest about how closely any society's approach to punishment and justice, including our own contemporary systems, actually reflects that society's deeper values and power structures, and what might future generations eventually conclude about aspects of our own current approach to punishment and justice that we don't yet fully recognize as requiring serious ethical reconsideration?